So as an autistic person, I've struggled a lot with gender, which is common for autistic people, both in terms of understanding how neurotypical people understand it and why, as well as my own gender identity. I actually identified as non-binary for 7 years. And even before that, I had periods where I did not want to be a boy, did not want to be a man, based on what people would tell me how boys and men were or should be. And when I read Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness I think I was like 16, I was electrified. I loved this idea of basically gender fluidity and wished that it was real. And I was sort of obsessed with that for a long time. And now I've come to the conclusion that really what's going on with me is that I am an autistic, ADHD, ADHD man, and there's nothing about me that is really weird gender-wise in the context of men who have both autism and ADHD. It's just weird from neurotypical standpoints. But it took me a long time to get there, and so I mentioned actually in a previous video on the anti-library, this book is obsolete for me now, and that's because based on what I know of Judith Butler, I think a lot of what she says is probably true on a very pedantic level, but it's not useful. However, there are 9 books that I think are actually useful for me that help me figure out, okay, this is what's going on with my gender identity, is I'm just a neurodivergent man, and people are telling me things about how men and boys are or should be, and that just was frustrating and confusing to me. And so I wanted to talk about those books. And the first of these I actually read way back in 2019, I think. And this was, I've mentioned before, my father recommended 5 self-help books to me. He knew that I, at the time, wasn't reading self-help, but there were 5 where he's like, at various times, I know you don't read self-help, but you should really read this. 3 of them I read. 2 of them I still have not read, but now that I have this channel, I kind of want to read them to talk about, see how, was my father right? Are they useful? But there's reasons I didn't read those 2. But this one is one of the 3 that I read, and it is The Male Factor, which is a book on what women in the workplace don't know about how men operate. And so why was this book so useful to me? Well, my father was almost certainly also undiagnosed. So I was not diagnosed with ADHD until early 30s. I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 10. My father wasn't diagnosed with anything ever, but he almost certainly had ADHD and autism. And so a lot of the advice in this book is advice about how to understand neurotypical men who actually tend to run the workplace. And a lot of the things she says about how women operate are also ways that, at least my father and I, a lot of neurodivergent men operate and think. And so it was really eye-opening for my father, and it was really eye-opening for me. But I still didn't really take away the conclusion, okay, what's going on? By this point, I was identifying as non-binary, and I didn't take away the conclusion, okay, maybe I'm just a neurodivergent man, and that makes some gender things weird. And so then there were 3 books that I read towards the end of 2023, early 2024, that sort of shattered a lot of the defenses I'd built up about trying to understand gender and started letting me see things for the first time. And I wanted to talk about these. The first one is this book by Shauna McGuire, which features a character named Ansi. This is actually the second book featuring Ansi, and I really relate to her. And I love this whole series, The Wayward Children. It's one of my favorite modern fantasy series, and it's novellas, so they're short. And they're all kind of standalone, except a few have sequels. But anyways, I really related to the character of Ansi and a lot of sort of how she thought about things. There's also a Magpie character in here named Hudson, and if you look at my avatar, you will notice there is a common Eurasian magpie on top, and a Australian magpie on the bottom. Common magpies are actual corvids, Australian magpies are not, but I love both of them for different reasons. And I'll link to, I have on my consulting website, I have a description of why I started calling myself Magpie after my father died. But anyways, my avatar for this channel, the common magpie at top has glasses and a quill pen, which is based on the character of Hudson in these books. And so there was something in this book that got me thinking about the previous book with Ansi as well, and sort of started to crack my thinking about gender a little bit. And then I read this book by Alison Bechdel, Fun Home, which is a graphic novel. And I mentioned in my very first video on this channel, Lessons from My Father's Library, my father read a lot of graphic novels. I really did not, and I only took one shelfful he had like 2-3 bookcases of them, and I only took one shelfful. And so I was looking up, I should read more graphic novels like my father did. I was trying to read more widely. What are the best regarded graphic novels? And this was towards the top. And so I read this. And this is the book that has helped me come to terms with my father's death the most. And that's for 2 reasons, which is, first of all, Her relationship with her father is a lot like my relationship with my father, but it's better in two ways, which are, first of all, she had to come to terms with some stuff that her father did that she learned about after his death, and my father never did anything like that. The second thing is her father killed himself when she was in undergrad, and my father died of natural causes when I was in my 30s. And so I had basically an extra decade with my father, and when he died, he was living his best life, and as far as I know, wasn't doing anything like her father, but I still felt seen, and I related to a lot of what she was saying. I also related to a lot of the gender issues she was having. I don't know if Bechdel is neurodivergent or not. And there's also, so lesbians often have more similarities with men, so it could go both directions. But I was relating to a lot of the struggles she was having, and that sort of started cracking open, trying to figure out what's going on more. And then I was thinking about my father, and so my brother mentioned that when my father died, he was reading bell hooks. And so I knew bell hooks. I hadn't read her, and I'm like, okay, which of her books would my father have probably been reading? And I realized this was a book she wrote, a book about the relationship of men to feminism. And I'm like, that is probably the book my father was reading. And so I read it, and it's a good book in general, but chapter 7 was really eye-opening because she called out something that I have dealt with my whole life, but sort of been in denial about, which is most of my issues with gender come from women telling me that men are this way or boys are this way or are supposed to be this way. And some of these women have been more traditional, but a lot of them have identified as feminists. And when a feminist is telling you do this thing like as a man, like it was a contradiction that I was not acknowledging. And the way she was calling this out, I'm like, oh, this is, yeah, I have been dealing with this. And I realized, okay, yes, there's this double standard. It is still going on as a double standard, where women who identify as feminists are trying to cherry pick the parts of feminism they like and the parts of traditional gender roles they like. But that tells me maybe there is some merit in traditional gender roles, like not prescriptively, but like descriptively as what men and women tend to want. And so I started thinking maybe that could be the case. I identified as feminist, although never male feminist, from the age of 10 until shortly after I read this book. And it wasn't because of this book, but that was when I started really seeing, oh yeah, this is just a thing. And I realized a lot of these conservative criticisms of feminism are based on how women who identify as feminists behave in practice. And I was responding with, well, feminist theory says this. And as someone who struggled with gender, I liked what feminist theory promised, but it wasn't actually in practice living up, for me as a man, for women either possibly, but certainly for me as a man, it was not living up to what it promised to do for men, because women who identify as feminists in practice reject those parts that aren't convenient, as Hooks called out decades ago and is still going on. And so then I was like, okay, maybe there is some merit to some of these, again, as a descriptive approach to what men and women want, not as a prescriptive, this is how you have to do gender. But then I read this book. And so I have 3 parrots. I've been obsessed with parrots since I was a kid. And the Kia parrot of New Zealand is, I think, the best model for convergent evolution for humans. And I've thought this for a while. And I actually did a presentation at Houston Nerd Nights, which I'm going to redo and do as a video as a collaboration between this and my hiatus Animal Arts and Crafts channel, probably. But that's going to be a longer video at some point that's sort of more based on a slideshow. However, I read this book, and one thing that really struck me was, again, these birds I think of as they convergently evolved with a lot of the same habits and features as humans, and I realized there are some really interesting parallels in terms of behavior between male and female Kias and male and female humans, or at least like, so a lot of what people call traditional gender roles are actually very local and not universal, and one of the books I will talk about gets to that a bit, but there are certain patterns that you tend to see like cross-culturally no matter what, and I'm not going to get into those here, but I will say that I was aware of some of those already, and I was looking at this and I'm like, oh, some of these cross-cultural gender role commonalities are similar with this bird that evolved convergently to us, but is hundreds of millions of years separated by evolution, and that, it tells me, there may be a reason for some of these things. And then I was like, okay, well, I actually have this book by a primatologist, Frans de Waal, on the subject of gender, which I have not read, but he is a good writer. And I'm like, I should read this book. And there were sort of 3 takeaways from this book. And the first one, probably the most trivial, was just he had an experience with the feminist group at his college, which was very similar to ones that I have had, except he pushed back at them, whereas I tried to go along and drove myself crazy trying to do that. The next one is, so very much as a neurodivergent person, I tend to like mixed sex, mixed gender groups and organizations. And part of this is that single gender, single sex groups and organizations I think of as being kind of toxic in different ways, or at least unpleasant for the people in them. And so the issues I have with all male groups, there are commonalities with how male chimpanzees behave. And so chimpanzees are a species dominated by male alliances. And then most of my friends have been women, so I've seen how girl groups treat other women. And the issues with that I've known since middle school, high school, is very similar to how bonobos, which are dominated by female bonobos, work. And I'm like, okay, yeah, these are our close relatives, and the problems with single-sex groups and our closest relatives seem very similar to the issues I have with single-sex groups in humans. And then the third thing about this is there is this chimpanzee, I think named Ruth, who, by human standards, she would probably be both intersex and neurodivergent. And she acted in ways that did not conform to, like, she wanted to hang out with the boys and interact with them, and they let her do that, but they didn't get her involved in the aggression. And I'm like, okay, there are apes that are gender non-conforming and possibly neurodivergent, like in our closest relatives, and that is sort of, maybe that is basically neurodivergent humans and apparently neurodivergent apes. There are similarities. Maybe this goes back before we became humans. And then I read this book by Robin Dunbar, and there was really one chapter on gender, one also, I think, on autism, but it was the gender one that was really interesting to me, because I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, like a lot of these things that he is talking about as sort of human universals for gender, because I'd already sort of known some of them, but then when he's highlighting them, I'm like, yeah, I tend to have the same preference patterns as men, but often they manifest in different ways. And if I think about, I know, so you'll see there are often ways that neurodivergent men may act more feminine and ways that neurodivergent women may act more masculine. But if you know a lot of, I mean, most of my friends are autistic and or ADHD. Basically all my friends are either definitely or probably autistic or ADHD. And you look at that and it's like, yeah, there are definite gender differences even in neurodivergent people. But they're not the same differences as neurotypical people, but they do, I see, like, looking at Dunbar, and I'm like, yeah, I still see a lot of these tendencies. And so then, two other books, and I forget which I read which, and I'm not certain this is the one, but I'm going to do this next, is, so Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I am a Quaker. I am not a Christian. I started to describe myself as a Daoist friend, but I still really like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, and in this book, I think it is, he was talking about gender. And there are a couple things in there. So one is he was talking about the ways that mothers and fathers tend to act differently. And I've sort of known, like, people have talked about, like, there's differences in how men and women parent that seem to be common cross-culturally. But one thing that really stuck with me is he basically said something like, the role of the mother is to protect the children from the outside world. The role of the father is to protect the outside world from the children. I'm like, that actually fits with a lot of what I've seen. He also, I think it was in this book, that he defended the role of single-sex spaces, because what you've had is basically women demanded admission to men's spaces, and men were like, yeah, fine, whatever. And then there are still women's spaces, but they're rarer and come under question as well. And he basically made the case for why these are a good thing. And I was like, well, I don't want a single-sex men's space. I attend some events that are basically, like, my existentialist philosophy reading group is basically all men, and there will be a woman or two who comes every second or third time. But, like, I don't like spaces that are exclusive based on sex. But reading this, I'm like, yeah, I can see why this is maybe a valuable thing for neurotypical people. And then there was this final book by Ivan Illich, who is a Catholic monk who had some really interesting ideas. And I first learned about him, I was going to read his book, Deschooling Society in undergrad, and I never actually got around to doing that. And then I was getting that, and I got it, and I haven't read it yet. But I saw he wrote this book, and I'm like, oh, this is something. So by the time I read C.S. Lewis, I was fully already, like, identifying, yeah, I'm just an autistic man, and that is sort of why I am weird. And I'd also stopped identifying as a feminist around the time that I read Franz de Waal. I forget if it was before or after. I mean, I still believe in a lot of the arguments that feminist theorists make. I just don't want to deal with the double standard identity stuff. And so anyway, so then this book, he's talking about, basically, he acknowledges most of what people think of as gender roles have been very different across cultures. But there have been a few sort of meta rules that have been common. And one thing that is unusual about modern industrialized cultures is that there is a need to try to flatten gender. And that has, in practice, led to basically trying to make women be more like men because that has more social prestige. And you have women who are worried about, okay, I don't want to be in an abusive relationship. I need like a job that pays well in case that happens, right? And when you have a relationship, so you still have the women doing most of the child work and house care. And basically, so at the time, like the job market still more favored men, but I think Illich acknowledged, like, when you have the managerial, the office work, that can be men or women. And now I think we're at a place where women are actually better at doing what people want for managerialist work, and they're actually more employable. And you're seeing a spate of men being unemployable because men don't really do what they want. Basically, so when you have this flattening of gender that's basically trying to make women be more like men, it has basically eroded like women's energy, social trust. And so you have, second wave feminism came out of a reaction to that. So as I was editing this video, I realized there were a couple of things that I wanted to say that I didn't say that I'm going to add quickly. So one of them is I talked about this book and his idea that in order to make the modern economy, society work, you need to flatten, abolish gender. And what ends up happening is it's mostly trying to make women conform to men's expectations, which is basically the premise of this book, where it's assuming that most bosses are still going to be neurotypical men and you need to act like they do if you're a woman. And also, like, women who rise to the top are going to be the ones who adopt these patterns. And that is also sort of bell hooks in The Will to Change is talking about where these upper middle class white women sort of had this idea that feminism means they get to act the way that upper middle class white men had been acting, and get to as opposed to had to. So you have this idea that flattening of gender has meant, okay, let's make women act more like men. And I think now, potentially, you're starting to see with the rise of managerialism, especially in this new economy, I think women are more employable based on what the managerial economy wants, or at least women who've been sort of flattened in this way to act more like men. But that's something that is past when these books were written, sort of a new, even this one, this is a phenomenon that is pretty recent that I'm observing, but it's coming in the context of women have already sort of been flattened towards acting more like men. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was, again, C.S. Lewis, I believe it was in this book, was talking about the whole single-sex spaces thing, which Ivan Illich in Gender talked about a little bit as well. And I have two stories about that. So one of them is when my father died, his neighbor wanted to join his men's group. And they're like, well, it's a men's group. And she's like, well, I don't like single-sex spaces. And I was like, yeah, I prefer heterosocial spaces as well. But it is a men's group. And the neighbor was kind of annoyed about that. And then later, I have an acquaintance who, she was in a chess club that was overwhelmingly male, and so it had these patterns that you see with single-sex male spaces, some of these toxic patterns that were frustrating to her. And she was like, I want to make a women's-only chess club to address this. And with my own sort of biases, thinking that, well, female-only spaces often have their own issues, and I also like heterosocial spaces, it's like, couldn't you make a chess club that had the rules for how you want people to behave to start with? And it might attract mostly women. But what I wasn't getting is, so this is a woman, she's an autistic woman, but she does like single-sex spaces. And a lot of neurodivergent people tend to often feel more comfortable with the opposite sex, but not always, and not all the time. And so I wasn't getting that with what she was saying, and I was sort of missing the point. So anyways, wanted to add those two things. Thanks. Like, his point was there has been this move to, like, abolish, flatten gender. And this book, again, that I didn't read by Judith Butler, I'm like, okay, yeah, that is actually, like, after reading Illich, and after reading C.S. Lewis, and after reading some of these primatologists, and the Parrot book that I showed you, husband and wife couple, by the way, but after reading all these things, I'm like, as a descriptor of the preferences that men and women have, there are some valid differences to gender. The problem comes when you are being prescriptivist, which I am still opposed to, but I'm like, okay, well, let me examine what I want. And I realized I have a lot of very male preferences, just as a neurodivergent person, they manifest in different ways. And so these are again, the 9 books that helped me sort of understand gender as a neurodivergent person and realize, oh, I'm kind of normal for an ADHD man. It's just neurotypical standards about men and women, combined also with the flattening of gender, have made things very difficult to figure out. And so anyways, that's it for today. I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.